from Mindful Men in Australia, is joining us today. He is a social worker. He's going to talk to us about OCD, otherwise known as obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm going to talk about anxiety. I'm sure there's going to be probably a little something in there about fatherhood. There's just a lot that Simon is bringing us today, and I'm so grateful for you showing up and all the work you've done and trying to get ready for this summit. It's awesome.
Awesome. No, thanks for having me. It's really good to be here, and well done to you for getting a whole bunch of blokes together at the same time from across the globe. Just getting one bloke to do something can be difficult sometimes. So getting a whole bunch of us, well done to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's cool. We've got you from Australia, Henry's from Uganda, Tyler's from Canada, just listening in on the background. And then Dr. John was coming to us from California in the United States. So really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And the end of that conversation just flows, really nicely into this conversation, because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, or that you guys were talking about just then, and a lot of the stuff that I do in Mindful Men is around social context and social constructs, and it's how society essentially creates meaning about what is, normal, quote unquote, and what's acceptable as well. And so I guess my story is a mental health story. And like many of the conversations that I've been able to tune into, and even the end one there is a lot of the stuff that men are told taught when they're very young, as boys, comes out in their adulthood, and a lot of guys are struggling with where they're at and what they can do about that as well. So I guess I like to start off from the start and paint a bit of a picture of where I've come from. But first, I'll just say where I am at the moment. So I'm a 39-year-old man from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. I am a father. I've got two little kids and a husband as well. And this week I'm bacheloring. Actually, my wife and kids are on a holiday at the moment, so it's very quiet at home. And yesterday I watched a movie for the first time in 3 years that wasn't a child's movie. So I'm pretty excited. It was a pretty good time to be in my household. But that's where I am now. But it's taken me a long time to get here. And I guess social context is really important for me as a social worker to understand, where I've come from, to understand where I am today, both at a micro level, so me in the community, but also at a macro level, me in the world as well. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in a place called Adelaide, South Australia, so not in Queensland. And where I grew up, I guess it was before social media, it was before smartphones, it was before broadband internet as well. I'm not sure if you remember dial-up internet. And where I grew up was very much of a working class area. It was a lot of manufacturing, a lot of tradespeople, services role. Like my mum was a cleaner, my dad worked at the local council. And then lots of pockets of welfare as well. I lived in an area where there was huge pockets of low socioeconomic people. And I guess my world was constructed by this kind of environment and the people around me and the things that we did in this environment as well. So for me, I grew up with 3 brothers in the household and dad. So a very male orientated household. And we played sport. So Australia is very much a sports culture. We love our sport and we love football. So I love Australian rules football, but there's areas in like Queensland, New South Wales that like rugby. So there's different types of footy here. Soccer, we call football soccer as well. So we've got that version of football. But I played Aussie rules football. And if anyone hasn't seen it, it's kind of like American football, but without the pads. And you don't just go, and you can get hit from all sorts of angles and so forth. And so to be a boy on that field and to be a man on that field was to be tough, and was to bottle up emotions, and you cross over that white line and you get the white line fever. And all of a sudden, you're a man, even though you're in boys' shoes and boys' shorts and boys' top as well. But you're a man because if you got hit, you had to get back up. And you had to almost play like a soldier. You'd have a coach on the side who would teach you, who would yell at you if you got things wrong or whatever. And you just had to pick yourself up. You had to brush yourself off. And But every now and then I'd get a tear if I got hit, or, the referee would blow a foul against me or whatever. But that was the emotional side of me that I then had to quickly bottle up, because I knew if somebody saw me have that tear, then I'd be a target from the other team, and a target from the coach, and even my other teammates as well. And so, we did that kind of thing. We watched a lot of football on TV as well. And I remember during the 80s and 90s that it was before times around concussion rules and blood rules and all that type of stuff, where you'd see players who, they've been knocked out, but they'd get up again and they'd stumble around on the oval, or they'd be, big hit to the head and they'd be bleeding profusely out of their head. And the commentators would be like, "Oh, look how masculine it is, look how brave he is," and all that type of stuff, because he's continuing on. And like these days, that doesn't happen. Like you get a concussion, you're taken off the field, you might not come back for a couple of weeks. They actually rule you out for a couple of weeks, and certainly with blood rules as well, you're straight off and get cleaned up as well. And then even also what we watched in movies and stuff like that. Like, I had two older brothers, so they always had control of the TV, and we were watching things like The Terminator and Die Hard and Rambo. So these hyper masculine movies. And even to TV advertising, there's lots of gambling and smoking adverts and drinking adverts. And so like my understanding of the world was influenced by all these things, like what I'm watching on TV, what it was like playing football on the football field, what it was like having three brothers and dad in the household, and talking about sport and looking up to these idols who were all, getting battered on the footy field and stuff like that. And I quickly learned that boys, this whole social construct around boys don't cry and boys don't show emotions, because everything that we saw about what it meant to be a man was the opposite. Just similar to that last discussion, it was around, what's socially accepted is it's boys being tough and strong, because that's what men are as well. And so, yeah, I bottled things up. And for the first 8 years of my life, I was kind of that happy-go-lucky kid, didn't really, nothing computed in terms of mental health. But then when I turned 8 years old, I developed what's called obsessive compulsive disorder. And I didn't know what this was, because in the 80s and 90s, nobody talked about mental health at all. But to define it, it's obsessive compulsive disorder. For a lot of people that don't understand what it is, it's an obsessive thought comes into our mind. So that's the O in OCD, and we can't get rid of it. It just cycles around and around and around, to the point where it creates a huge amount of distress and anxiety, and we don't really know how to deal with it. So we perform a compulsive act. It's a compulsion. It's the C in OCD. And so for me, like when I was 8 years old, I remember being in the schoolyard and another student came up to me and said, "Simon, if you stop talking for more than a minute, you're going to lose your voice forever." And this freaked me out. I'm like, no way, I can't lose my voice. That's, I was I was a happy-go-lucky kid. I was a bit of a larrikin. My voice was my tool. And if I lost it, that would be the end of the world for me. And so in order to alleviate the huge amount of distress that came with that, I started performing an act or a behavior, and that was humming to myself. And I was constantly humming to myself because I was checking that my voice was there. So if I thought that I would go on a minute or so, I'd do a little hum to myself. And it was very small hums, like mm, mm, that type of thing, and very quiet as well. Nobody would know that I was doing this. Wasn't a joyful thing that I was doing. It wasn't me skipping down the road humming a beautiful tune in my mind. It was me constantly checking that my voice was still there and still working. And then it becomes a disorder when we're doing this for more than an hour a day, and it's quite an impact on our day. But I would be doing this pretty much all day, every day. For the next 2 years, I would do this roughly. But at the same time, I didn't know how to tell anybody I was doing this. I didn't have the words or the vocabulary to say I'm doing this to my parents, for example. Like mum was the go-to, but I couldn't tell mum that I was doing this. I couldn't tell anybody that I was doing this. So I kept it silent, and I kept it silent for the better part of my life until I was 28. But in my teens, it ramped up. Mum and dad split up, and me and my little brother went with mum, and we moved out with mum. And I got this huge, overwhelming fear of things like safety and where we were in the world. And I felt the need to be the man of the house, whatever that means. And and so I would spend a lot of time checking around things like the doors were locked and windows were closed, and our gates were closed, and all these types of things, particularly at night time, because I felt like at night time that somebody might break in and steal our things. We didn't have much when mum moved out from dad's home, and or they'd come in and hurt us, they'd kill us, they'd kidnap us. And this petrified me. I was absolutely petrified. And so every night I would spend, 1 to 3 or to 4 hours checking the house. And this is as a, I'm talking about like 12, 13, 14 years old, doing this in silence because nobody else was up. Everyone, mum and my little brother went to bed. So I'd be up in the middle of the night checking and checking and checking. And I'd get back to bed after checking, and my brain would say, Simon, did you really check that door or that window? It's come unlocked when you checked it last time, or maybe you forgot that one. And so I get out of bed again and start the cycle all over again, because the thing with OCD is that you have to do things in particular orders in a lot of cases, not all the cases, but a lot of cases. And so my order was going around and checking, the front door first, and then the front windows, and then I'd scoot around the house in a bit of a circle and check things. And then sometimes I'd be outside checking gates outside, and cars were locked and all that type of stuff. And then it even developed into a fear of burning down in the night time. So if the stove was left on, or the iron was left on, or anything like that. And so I'd be checking electrical appliances as well. And this went on and on and on. And actually, I still live with this version of OCD today, and I'm 39 now, but I don't do it obviously as much as I used to do. My teens was like my darkest day, and I call them my darkest days because it's the first time I experienced suicidal ideation. I was so exhausted by checking every night that one night I put my head on the pillow and I said, I hope I suffocate and don't wake up. And it's the first time I'd experienced that kind of thought before. And I didn't know what it felt like. But it at the same time, something weird happened, and I don't know where this came from. And I've never been into affirmations or mantras or anything like that. And I said to myself for some reason, Simon, no matter how dark today is, the sun will always rise tomorrow. And what that did is it instilled a bit of, I guess, faith in me that, and I'm not a religious or spiritual person, but in some sort of faith that I can get through this dark time and come out the other side. And I guess I associated the sun with a new beginning, or warmth, or strength and hope. And so every night when I was doing this, I would just think of this little, I guess, affirmation, and just really look forward to, as much as I could in my darkest days, really look forward to that sun coming up the next day. I think potentially this has only just dawned to me. Maybe it was because the sun meant that I could stop checking again. I didn't have to go through the nighttime routine, because then it's a new day as well. And that's literally just dawned to me. So I've got to do some reflective process on that. But then it was also like, it wasn't just checking at nighttime. It was checking it on my way to school. So have I got my wallet and keys? And I would check that. And then my brain would say, Simon, did your wallet and keys fall out of your bag when you checked? And so I'd be doing this all day at school, checking because I checked. And it was exhausting, but I still didn't know how to tell anybody that I was doing this and why I was doing it. I didn't understand why I was doing all these things. And I did it because of the anxiety and distress that was coming with all these thoughts. I didn't know how to process them. But at the same time, as I said before, like in the 80s and 90s, we didn't talk about mental health. So I didn't know this was a mental health issue. I thought this was just a little personality thing for me that I had to try and work out and outthink. I had to try and think of a way myself to deal with. But yeah, so in 28 years, so this continued, and I eventually got into alcohol, and I used alcohol a lot to numb the brain, to slow things down, because my brain would operates at a rate of knots, and it operates very quickly to the point where sometimes my thoughts become distorted, and I lose track about memories or things like that. They become, is this real or whatever. But around 28 years old, my now wife encouraged me to go and get some help. And it was at that time when I was feeling pretty depressed, pretty anxious. My OCD was through the roof. And I think I came to that realization that I couldn't keep doing this anymore. It'd been 20 years of doing this in silence and trying to figure it out myself. And I hadn't really talked to anyone about it except for my now wife. And so off I went to the doctor's office, and I remember uttering the words, "I think I've got a mental health issue." And I nearly choked on the words as they came out. And but from there, it just felt like this huge weight lifted off my shoulders, because I could finally put words to whatever it was that was going around in my mind since I was 8 years old. And I guess what I was doing here is I was challenging that social construct that boys, you know, don't, or boys and men, they can show some vulnerability. They can talk about their feelings and their emotions, and it felt good to do it. It was the first time I'd ever done it, really, and it felt great to do it. And from there, things just got better the more and more I did it. And so for the next 10 years, I went a process of, I guess, diagnoses. I got a referral to a psychologist, and who I knew I was depressed. So I ticked that box. I knew I had some version of anxiety, so I ticked that box. I didn't know I had OCD. I didn't know what OCD was. And so that was a bit of a shock to the system. But what it did is it started a process of, I guess, self-discovery, and trial and error as well, in terms of medications and different types of therapy. But what it also did is it helped me to understand who I was as a person and come to grips with, I'm Simon. I've got 3 mental illnesses. And what I want to do from here is, I guess, is grow from this and learn about what it meant, because I really am a firm believer that knowledge is power. And with knowledge that we can grow as people and recover from whatever we're struggling with. And so for the next 10 years, I went on this journey and trialed different things. And it got to a point in 2020 where I burnt out. And what that happened was I was, I guess, living with this mental illness and trying to still work through that. We had a young family, so had 2 kids under 3, I think it was at the time. I was studying part-time to become a social worker, and I was still working my full-time job as well, in a high stressful work environment. And then we had COVID as well. So all these things I had been juggling with for a long time. And then COVID just, I guess, was the last straw on the camel's back. And we went into months of lockdown where we were working from home. We were lucky that we didn't have to school our children at home because they weren't at school age yet. But I know a lot of families were doing both the work and the teaching role as well at home. But we had a young family, so trying to keep them entertained for days and days and weeks and months on end, it was quite a challenge. And so I burnt out, and I ended up taking 4 or 5 months off of work because I just couldn't function anymore from a mental and physical perspective. I was just absolutely spent. But what that enabled me to do was, I guess, look inwards and do a bit more reflection. And actually, from there, I discovered my first, I guess, entry into mindfulness was from here in my mental health social worker, and she encouraged me to do what am I grateful for, the big 3 things that I'm grateful for. And the reason for that was when we're burnt out, or particularly when we live with mental illness as well, is that we often look at the world or we look at the glass as being half empty as opposed to being half full. We can be very negative about things. And I guess that's a protective measure as well, is like everything can be a struggle for someone living with mental illness. But particularly burnout, it saps the joy out of you and you become very cynical. And so by looking at what I was grateful for, it was meant to bring in the joy. But for, like many people, looking at the big 3 things about what brings you joy and what you are grateful for, you start to regurgitate that every other day. And so most people, and this happened to me, was like they'd pick family, they'd pick a house, they'd pick a job. I call them the big 3 things. And I found that I just lost interest in mindfulness. I'm like, no, this is boring. This doesn't work. I know I've got these things. I know I'm grateful for these things, but surely there's more to life than just these three things. So I gave mindfulness up very, very quickly. And in all the conversations I have with people that do mindfulness, they feel the same with these big three things that they're meant to find every day. And people say, oh, you're not meant to do the same three things every second day. Like you have to pick something different. But often people just can't. It's like it's hard to pick something different. And so I gave it up and I didn't go back to it. But what I did do as part of my recovery was I essentially took the mask of mental illness off. And it was the first time I felt the need to go back to work and talk about burnout in particular, because we worked in a very stressful workplace and I knew other people felt the same. And so I felt the need to go to work and prepare a presentation and say, this is what burnout is. This is what the signs to look for. I'd never heard about it until I experienced it. But going to work and doing that, and then like other people would come to me and they say, Simon, I'm feeling the same. I'm feeling similar. Or other people that I had known had been off of work that I just thought were on a holiday, they were actually on mental health leave for burnout. And so what it did is it kind of helped a lot of people in the workplace to open up and say, yeah, I'm feeling the same. Maybe I should go and see a doctor and maybe, trial some therapy or whatever. But I also use that as an opportunity to say, I've also lived with obsessive compulsive disorder and depression and anxiety, and I'm a bloke and I'm talking about it. And it's the first time that I went public with my mental illness. Like I'd spoken to my GP, I'd spoken to my therapist, I'd spoken to my wife. Nobody else knew that I lived with mental illness. And so it was like me unmasking and challenging everything that I learned for the 28 years, or no, it was longer than that, 35 years or so prior to that boys can't talk about this stuff and men can't talk about this stuff. And men should just toughen up and drink some alcohol and just bury it really deep down, because nobody wants to hear men's issues around mental health. But what it did is so many people said, Simon, now I understand some of the things you say or do. And I was saying the same. I'm like, yeah, like the more I think about it and the more I talk about it, I had just had a light bulb moment a bit earlier, the easier it is. And the more I start to understand who I am and the more I can start to live authentically and stop living this double life where on the outside, you wouldn't know that I have a mental illness. On the inside, I am a complete mess half the time, a lot of the time, actually. And so it was really a good process to come out and talk about mental illness in the workplace. And then from there, I started a bit of a social media campaign as well, in terms of jumped on Instagram and started the Mindful Men Instagram page where I could talk about my journey as well to bigger audiences. And Instagram was an interesting thing because a lot of people say how bad social media is and how toxic it can be, but it can also be really, I guess, a great way to build community and feel less alone in the world. And what happened with Instagram for me, it was that finding other people that live with OCD was incredibly difficult. And in fact, there's not many OCD specific treatment or therapy practices in Australia that I could find. But I found a whole bunch of people on Instagram that live with OCD. And it was really interesting to see that, because I only ever knew my version of OCD, and I still didn't really know the intricacies of OCD. I knew it was a label. I knew I had to do these behaviors and these thoughts, but it was very superficial. But then finding all these people that had different themes I didn't know there were different themes of OCD and types and ways that people had done certain things. And it felt like all of a sudden I was less alone in the world. And it felt like I was I was no longer the only person in the world that lived with OCD. I was part of this community of people that are very supportive of each other, because we know how difficult it is to live with it. With a condition that's often trivialized when other people talk about it. So when people talk about it in the media or even in the workplaces or even in your social circles, a lot of people say, oh, my OCD is killing me because of this, this, and this. But in reality, that's not OCD. What they're talking about is not OCD. So a classic example in the workplace would be, we're looking at a PowerPoint presentation and it might be a full stop that's missed off a sentence. And so many, you would be surprised at how many times I've heard this is someone would say, oh, my OCD is killing me because this PowerPoint presentation doesn't have this full stop at the end of the sentence. Or, my highlighter pen is a green pen, but it's got a yellow lid on it. And it's really, my OCD is killing me about that. That's not OCD. That's just being pedantic. And if these people actually knew what it was like to be checking house doors for 4 hours a night, or to be checking this, that, and something else for hours, and then if they knew what it was like to check that your voice was still working as an 8-year-old, they wouldn't care so much about the PowerPoint presentation or the pen lids or whatever. But they're the common things. So OCD becomes trivialized in society, and even in the movies, you see it's very similar in the movies. It might just be around washing hands, but OCD is much more than washing hands. Like I wash my hands the normal amount of times that other people wash their hands. But people with contamination OCD might wash their hands to the point where they can almost see bone. Like it can be, it's that debilitating. And so, yeah, but coming out and talking about it, it felt liberating. And then through the Instagram page, it felt liberating. And this is where I learned a bit more about OCD, in the fact that it's what's called a silent condition or a silent disorder. And it takes on average someone about 15 or so years from first symptom to first treatment for OCD, just because of how profound and distressing it can be, and weird as well. Like the voice thing, I look back on that and go, yeah, Simon, that's a weird thing to do. But it was something that in my mind was a very real thing, that if I didn't do it, I had, that it would be the end of my voice. Thankfully, I don't do that anymore. But yeah, like understanding that how silent it is and how many people suffer in silence is, and particularly men as well. Like, to be a man talking about mental illness, there's not many that do it. I'm seeing a bit more, and we're seeing evidence through this summit here of more men talking about it, but there's still a lot of shame and stigma associated with men talking about these types of things. I was talking to a guy on a podcast the other day who on his podcast comment thread, there was someone saying, we don't want any more men talking about mental health. And it's like people get triggered by this type of stuff, but it needs more men to talk about that, because when we look at statistics, and I'm Australian based, I look at Australian statistics, but 75% of suicide deaths are men. And then also 75, I guess, percent of perpetrators of domestic violence are men as well in Australia. And so what this is telling me is that we have struggled to talk about things. And so the more that men can talk about things and process things and get help for whatever they're dealing with, it doesn't necessarily have to be mental illness. It could be relationship issues or a job loss. It could be grief. It could be anything really. It could be them just trying to figure out, are they a man or whatever, their identity. The more we can get guys talking about stuff, the healthier we can be as a society, and we start to see some of that data come down. But it was around the burnout stage. I've gone back to work. I've shared my story, but I also went back into therapy as well, into a different therapy a little bit later on. And this is where I found mindfulness again. And my new therapist, because I like to shop around for different therapists and try different styles as well, because I think that we can't just go to the same person all the time, because I've got one perspective of the world as well. So for me, I was trying to find a guy, and there's not many guys around that work in mental health, and so I did find one, and he was experienced in mindfulness. I was ready to give it a go again, and his perspective was a whole lot different. And so we ditched the whole 3 things we're grateful for, and we went to finding the small things in our day-to-day routine that we're grateful for. And he gave me this really cool tool that I use now all the time. It's breaking your day down into hourly chunks, and just noting what you do in those daily chunks. So for me today, it's like 5 o'clock. I got up and I spent the first hour just getting ready for the day. And 6 a.m. I'm on this I was going to call it a podcast, but a summit. And then, yeah, like later on, I'll go for a walk, and then I might, my kids aren't around, my family, my wife's not around, so I might watch some TV or go out and do some gardening and stuff like that. And it's just taking note of all these things that we're doing in the day. And then from there, we can pick 3 things that we were grateful for during that day. So, for example, it could be this 6 o'clock, summit where I can come on and talk about mental health. It's something that I am grateful for because it's a platform where I can share my story and hopefully help just one person out there realize that they've got a mental health issue that they need to go and address. And so from there, we can pick 3 things, and they tend not to regurgitate so much because our days aren't exactly the same. So we're not talking about I'm grateful for having the roof over my head, unless maybe there was a storm and half the house, knocked down or whatever, but you're grateful that you were in the room that didn't knock down or something like that. Or, we're not grateful for, our families, but we're grateful for that cup of coffee that me and my wife had at the cafe that time, or being able to get the kids to school on time and all that type of stuff. They're the little things every day that we kind of overlook. And then once we can tune into those little things, that we can realize, oh, I did some pretty cool things today. And I did some things that filled me up and filled my cup up and gave me joy. And I find that's a better way to practice gratitude. But we extended on that, and I got into things like using my 5 senses to ground myself. So with an OCD brain and an anxious mind, my mind would often be elsewhere. It won't necessarily be in conversations that I am. It's funny because I could be having a conversation, an in-depth conversation with someone, but I might be thinking about something else. But the other person wouldn't know that. Sometimes it happens on things like podcasts. When I'm talking to people, my mind starts racing and going on a different planet. And it happens a lot as a dad. Like my kids will be screaming in front of me, and I'm just standing there nodding or shaking my head, but I'm not on planet Earth. I'm on Mars or something like that, like with my brain. And so using my 5 senses, I'm able to come down back to Earth and back into my body and ground myself in the moment. So it's like just tuning into the smells, the sights, touch. Like if my kids are banging on my leg saying, "Dad, Dad, Dad," and so it's tuning into that. And what it helps do is it just brings me back to the moment and stop thinking about yesterday, which I often think about a lot of things from the past, but also stop thinking about what I need to do later today or even tomorrow as well. Because I heard this really cool quote once that when we spend too much time thinking about the past, it can lead to things like depression, and I'm prone to depression. But when we think too much into the future, it can lead to things like anxiety. And so we're trying to constantly battle these two. But the only real thing that we can control, or not even really can control, is just experience, is the present moment. And so by grounding ourselves in the moment, we can just feel it more alive and just tune into what really matters most. And it could be our child in front of us who's screaming, or our wife who wants our attention, or someone on a podcast or a summit or something like that who's paying attention, and just tune into that moment. And so through these types of things, I'm like, okay, I'd start to discover what mindfulness actually is. It's less so the big 3 things you're grateful for, but it's things that you're grateful for on the everyday, being able to ground yourself and use tools like sitting through anxiety and getting over the peak of anxiety, and allowing that emotion to come into our bodies and not try to deflect the emotion. It's actually just accepting the emotions as they come into our bodies, and working with that and going, oh, why am I triggered? And exploring the whys of why we're getting triggered and so forth. So I found this is really cool. And it was just embedded in my social work studies. So in my last placement, we had to do 1,000 hours of work placement to finish our degree. And I did mine in a private therapy practice. And I got introduced to Dr. Russ Harris, who utilizes acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a mindfulness-based practice. Very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, but in a slightly different tweak. And I got introduced to him and started reading up about his work and the tools and tips and tricks that some of them I've already talked about. They're just very simple that you can do. And at first when people talk about mindfulness, guys think it's a bit hippie, it's a bit woo-woo or whatever, but it really does work. And I know because I've been using it in my own therapy. Now I just had the framework about who developed some framework around it, and I was able to pick and choose the things that I liked out of that. And then in the guys that I worked with, they really bought into it because there was an added component. It wasn't just about getting through distress or stress or anxiety in the moment. It was also around tuning into our values and using, what makes us tick, and using those values to set purposeful goals and meaning in our life as well. And guys particularly really love this stuff because we've never really done it. We might be having these conflicts with social constructions about what it means to be a man, but then we go on autopilot. We become adults and we just do a day-to-day Groundhog Day style, life. But when we can stop and pause and think about our values and think about what we actually want with life and where we want to go, and maybe we have to pivot, maybe we're going in the wrong direction, guys really loved it. And so I'm like, and I loved it as well. I loved seeing it in the guys in the work that we were doing. And so luckily I got to a point at the end of last year where I finished my degree and I'm like, I want to take this further. I've always wanted my own business. And so I founded Mindful Men, the therapy business as well. So it moved from the social media space into my own therapy business. And everyone said, oh, you got a niche down in business. I'm like, well, I know my niche, it's men and mental health and disability as well. So I also work in the disability space, but it's around helping guys just to open up and get vulnerable and start a healing process using mindfulness and values and setting goals as well. And so that's what I'm doing now. And I absolutely love it, but it doesn't mean necessarily that I'm healed. Like I still live with my mental illness. But what I love about that these days is the more I critically reflect on my mental illness is that I am able to use it as fuel for my passion. A lot of people say they're not defined by their mental illness. My mental illness doesn't define who I am. But to me, I find it does to a certain degree. It gives me an understanding of how my brain works and what I need to be well. So, for example, am I sleeping right? Am I drinking too much alcohol, which was a big thing for a long time for me? Am I eating right? Am I getting exercise? Am I doing my self-care, tips and tricks as well? And so if I'm not doing that, I'm out of balance and I'm spiraling down pretty quickly. But also I've talked about it so much over the last 10 years. I know that when I am spiraling down, what I need to do to come back up again, it's reintroducing my self-care. It's mindfulness-based work. It's actually going to the doctor and saying, I need another referral to a psychologist or a counselor or a mental health social worker, because I need to talk to someone about it because my wife's not my therapist, even though, she does do a lot of therapy for me. Maybe it's also checking my meds as well. Like, are my meds the right meds for me? Because medications are a hit and miss. You can trial a lot. And, I've just recently gone onto a new one that I'm trialing, and it takes a while for them to work as well. So you've really got to commit to a longer game with medication. But for me these days, it's a normal thing to talk about. It's like, it's normalizing my mental health in the same way that we normalize physical health. So like we wouldn't hesitate to go to a doctor if we've twisted an ankle or broken a leg or got a back issue. It's the same with my mental health. As soon as I know that I'm struggling, I'll go off and talk to someone because I know how important it is. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much the story and what I do and why I do it. And I guess if there's any takeaways that I could offer the audience and people in the future is a few there. It's not weak for men to speak. We can challenge these social constructs of what it means to be a man, and we should challenge them because who we were in the 80s, 90s, or maybe you grew up earlier than I did. It's very different to 2022. And, if we're going to create a future generation, like for my son particularly, where he can feel that he doesn't have to grow up conforming to this social constructs of being tough and having to bottle things up, then we have to be the change makers now. We can be those change makers by having vulnerable conversations with our sons and with each other as well. And just recognizing that when we're not okay, that, we can go and get help. We don't need to put a Band-Aid on. A Band-Aid fix could be like going to the pub and drinking $200 worth of alcohol. It could be spending that $200 on a psychologist or a counselor or a social worker to actually talk about stuff and start developing those long-term, fixes that we've all been craving for, but we keep putting the Band-Aid fix on. So it's about readjusting our focus there as well. It's also around understanding that if you live with mental illness, it doesn't mean it's like the end of the world. you can still achieve things. You can still have a successful career. You can have family life. You just might need a bit of help, walking that path as well. And that's where psychologists and counselors and social workers, your doctor, your GP is a great place to start, because they see this day in and day out. And they've also experienced it as well. Like, I went to a doctor who has experience with burnout himself. And so he just understood what that meant for me, like when I was talking about burnout. And so that was an easier process as well. And I guess the last thing is that mindfulness isn't a hippie or woo-woo thing, is that you can use it, and it's good to use. It's a great tool. It's actually very popular at the moment, which is good, because I think a lot of people are looking outside those traditional therapies of cognitive behavioral therapy, because talking is hard. I get it. It's hard getting men into therapy, but once they do, they start unloading and getting vulnerable. But a mindfulness-based approach is really cool, because you can do it on the move. Nobody has to know you're doing it. You can do it all internally, and just reconnect with what's important. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah. Tyler's just been listening in the background. He said he's not really in a space to be able to engage with us in conversation. Unfortunately, I just wanted to be there as support. So Simon, thank you so much. Matthew Shapiro may be joining us to just continue on the conversation. I'm not sure when exactly he's going to pop in here. It might be 4 o'clock, might be a little bit earlier, to just talk. And I really appreciate you so vulnerably sharing all about your personal life and your process. And yeah, it's been good to listen to for all of that. And I feel like a lot of people can probably resonate with, all of those things: burnout, anxiety, depression, OCD. There's a lot of things that people are struggling with around the globe right now.
Absolutely. And I think COVID really accelerated this mental health discussion movement, which is, it's probably one of the coolest things, or the better things of COVID. There wasn't many good things aside from being able to work from home, which was really nice. But yeah, more and more from COVID, more and more people experience burnout during COVID, but also experience this need to vocalize mental health discussions. And I thought that was really cool. And I experienced burnout as well, but I guess it just gave me that fuel to go, yeah, let's just talk about it. And so many good things happen when we talk about it. We can deconstruct those social constructs, and we can look at life in a different way, but we can also just get the help that we've needed for so long. I wish I didn't wait 20 years to talk about mental health, but I didn't, and I always think back to that and go, well, my mum and dad did the best with the tools that they had at the time.
Right.
Not that we ever talked about it, but I guess if I did try to talk about it, they'd try to help me as best as they could. But at the same time, society, I don't think, was ready for mental health in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't certainly in the dictionary where I grew up. So,
yeah, I feel like it was still stigmatized even where I was growing up, because I'm an 80s and 90s kid myself. And it wasn't, I feel like, until really maybe the mid 2000s that it became remotely acceptable to go to counseling. Like if you went to counseling, most people were just like, you're crazy. Like, what are you fucked up about? It was just a whole thing. And it's an interesting journey. And I think there's still some stigmatization, obviously, about mental health, which is why we're doing the summit, in part to reduce the stigma that's associated with mental health and get people to feel like there's safe spaces and resources for them around the globe where they can reach out to fellow men to be like, hey, I heard yours talk and that makes sense. And I'd love to get some support because this is what I'm struggling with. And I think with the pandemic and everything, people just had a lot of their coping mechanisms stripped away to reveal what was actually going on with them. And it's good to get to the root of what we're struggling with, preferably not due to global terrible things that are happening, but we are here now and coming together in community to support one another, and support is always a good thing.
Absolutely. And sometimes it takes those big global things to bring it to the forefront as well. But also sometimes it's not those big global things. Sometimes it's the smallest thing in the world. And And often I hear the people say like, oh, I'm struggling right now, but the person next to me or down the road is struggling more, so we should focus on them. I think we should just focus on everybody. Everybody should just focus on their own situation, because your situation might be small compared to mine, or vice versa, but it doesn't negate the need for you to, or the importance of you getting help in the first place, because the quicker you can get through it, then it doesn't have so much of a hold on your life. And for someone who, like me, who bottles it up for 20 years, you don't just flip a switch and then it's fixed. You don't just go to a psychologist and it's fixed, or take meds and it's fixed. It takes a lot of unpacking and a lot of trial and error. And the longer you hold on to it, the harder it is to let go of some of these things. Like for me, living with OCD, like doing my checking routine at 39, it's still very hard for me not to do those things. And I'm working with my doctors on that, with my psychs on that. But it's still very hard. Whereas if I got to it at the root of the cause, like when I was 8 or 9, maybe it would never have progressed into what it is, because it is treatable. It's not you can treat it, and exposure response prevention is a great way to treat it. Which is only something I found last year or the year before, is exposure response prevention. But it is treatable. You don't have to suffer in silence. You can get on it. And the earlier you get onto it, the better, because these things fester away. And if you fester away for too long, then bad things do happen. We get angry, we violently erupt. I talked about that data around suicide and family domestic violence. Like, that's the result of bottling things up and not processing emotions in a healthy way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Simon, as we come to our close, is there anything else that you would like to bring forward that you feel like would meet the audience for future?
Yeah, I think
it's as on your heart in regards to masculinity and mental health.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it a lot, but I think it's just, actually, there's a great Tony Robbins quote that I love, and it's the guys that will walk into my office and my therapy clinic, and I'll give my website in a second. It's they're in this mode. Is that change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. And so for a mental health discussion, you do really need to be in some sort of a space where you're ready to commit to some sort of change process. And it might be very small. It might be just that change process is you just talking about mental health, just talking about it. That's change, because before that you weren't talking about it. But then the more you can, as you go through the years, like it's taken me 10 years on my recovery pathway of talking more and more, and then you develop those self-reflection skills to go deeper and deeper every time. And then the more deeper you can go, the more insight you can develop, and then you can really get to what really works and what doesn't work as well. So, being pushed into therapy doesn't work. A lot of people, particularly in couples therapy, for example, the guy might be dragged to that as an ultimatum, but they're not really ready to commit. And that's where you don't really see them buy in. But where they buy in is when they're ready for some sort of change, because nothing changes if nothing changes, essentially. So open your heart, open your mind, be ready to hear different perspectives. Trial different therapists. It could be a man, it could be a woman, it could be someone from a different culture as well, because different worldly perspectives are really important to understanding who we are in the world as well. Like, I don't know everything, same as you don't know everything, but then combined, we have a lot of knowledge about different things. And so the more you can see those different perspectives, it's really useful. But if something's triggered you in this conversation and you want to work with me, I do therapy in Australia. So as a social worker, I'm only limited to Australia. But you can catch me at www.mindful-men.com.au. And that also links into my podcast as well. So I've got the Mindful Men podcast, where I have conversations like this with people all over the world. And what I found through the podcast is that while we're separated by land and sea, particularly in Australia, a lot of sea, our stories are very similar, and our coping strategies, no matter where we are in the world, they're very similar, and the pains are very similar, but also the triumphs and progress and growth is very similar as well. So that's a really cool way that people can almost get a therapeutic response. It's not therapy, the podcast, but it's a way of feeling less alone in the world, and it might just help with that critical reflection, going, oh yeah, Simon's talking to a social worker in California or somebody else, and they're talking about similar things, and maybe I can just tune into this and start to understand who I am as a person. So
oh, that's awesome. It really makes a difference as people are able to come together and find the support that they need. And anybody that's watching in the future, I hope that hearing from men from literally around the globe and similar perspectives has helped you understand that despite time, distance, and position in life, that we're all just human. We struggle with similar things, and to come together in community and have grace both with ourselves and more so with others as well.
absolutely.
So I'd like to thank some of our sponsors, for Lane Balone, who gave a book, The Humble Alpha, and donated one-on-one coaching for some of the men as audience members. We have Simon Osimo donating his book, having 10 powerful strategies for conflict de-escalation. We have the Foundation for Family and Community Services, Healing Services, my goodness, located here in Virginia, that donated modules, normally around $75, but just for $5 for the men that were on the summit as audience members, to help with relationship and wellness and a whole lot more. We have Brett D. Scott, who was kind enough to offer one of his 3-month coaching programs for one-on-one coaching, valued at, I believe, $5,900, which was very generous of him to do. And then we have our supporters of StrayFit, with Anthony Strayhorn having to do with personal training and wellness coaching. And we have the Fatherhood Foundation, helping to support fathers, the single fathers and fathers in relationship as well. So it's really nice to get to have men coming forward, and different organizations coming forward to help support men with literal global resources. So we'll see if we have anybody popping in at the last minute, quite literally the last minute. And I just want to thank again all the speakers who came on for the summit from around the world to support us in doing our best to have messaging coming forward to support guys on a global level. And you can find me, the host, Alicia Buss, at www.globalequineaffiliates.com. I also have the men's group, Global Resources for Men, on Facebook. And we have, of course, also the YouTube channel, which these recordings will probably at some point end up on, for Global Resources for Men as well. And we have previous recordings from the last 2 summits for masculinity and relationships, and masculinity in business. So we will pause this here.